welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Todd Kashdan, it is such a pleasure to be able to have you on this podcast and to be able to finally have an opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation, which I've wanted to do with you for years.
Oh, the feeling's mutual.
I recently devoured, reread your new book called The Art of Insubordination, which I have right here, and I am so excited to be able to talk with you about. So that's probably what we're going to be spending much of it today talking about. But of course, you've also been a very influential figure in the purpose and life world. And so maybe why don't we start, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what your connection to the topic of meaningful work is.
Sure. I had the serendipitous situation of starting grad school the same year Marty Seligman played with the term positive psychology, 1998. That was my first year. I met Marty Seligman, and I immediately switched from studying the onset of panic attacks to figuring out, based on Marty saying, hey, why don't you want to study things that are things people want to talk about at cocktail parties? And I quickly pivoted to studying curiosity, meaning and purpose in life, creativity, social relationships, friendships. And I founded the Wellbeing Laboratory as a grad student. And it's now the 20th year of over 250 scientific articles on this topic.
Wow. Incredible. Well, one of the things that you have done over the last 20 years is write one of the truly seminal papers on purpose in life. It was back in 2009. You did it with Patrick McKnight. I think that paper, by the time that this podcast comes out, will probably have been cited well over 1,200 times. And I mean, I'm curious about that, and actually a recent paper that you just did last summer that was basically how over that 20 years, this field has changed. So I'm just curious, just with that lens, what are some of the interesting things that have evolved over the last 20 years when it comes to purpose, when it comes to meaning? And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think one of the important things from our camp, and like you said, this is mostly with Patrick McKnight and Fallon Goodman and a few other people, is a lot of the things that were originally discussed as the defining features of purpose in life are actually things that could amplify it, or they're things in the environment that could influence it. And I think it's really important to understand the difference, because when you talk about something that can influence healthy construct, you're talking about a potential target of intervention. And so if you say that an enriching environment, for example, an opportunity-rich situation, you're not in a disadvantaged scenario, that's part of having a purpose in life. Well, now you don't target the idea of the percentage of land that's grassy and parkland versus asphalt. To what degree could that influence the probability that young kids in a neighborhood would increase a sense of purpose in life? Include it in the definition, you don't target it. And one of the really cool areas of research that we're figuring out is the people that are disadvantaged, whether that's their minority status, whether that's economic disadvantage, whether you don't win the cortical lottery and you end up being neurodivergent in some way, childhood adverse experiences. These are factors that influence the propensity to have a purpose. A lot of people with all of this, we'll call this loosely baggage, does not detract from your ability to have a purpose in life. What it does detract from is the ability to find time and effort to commit to that purpose in life. And that difference, to me, is a really important thing that we want to build on to create a more utopian society.
That's a really profound insight in terms of all those psychosocial factors that you're talking about that truly do have influence. They don't actually get in the way of us they aren't fundamentally a part of whether or not we can contain purpose in life or find meaning in our lives, but they give us the environment, the conditions in which we'll be able to build those realities in our lives. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah. And Building off what you just said, you can think about to what degree today have you created space for other people to work towards their purpose in life?
Mm,
Now, if you're a teacher, it's more obvious. But if you're, I don't know, if you're just working at a Dunkin' Donuts, you can still ask yourself when people are asking you questions for advice and talking about their experiences, do you create space for them such that their passions get to flourish through the extensions from conversing with you? And it's just like a nice way to think about the reciprocity and social interactions that can amplify a purpose.
mm. I mean, it also just makes me think about how important all of the design factors are that go into creating those conditions, right? Like this is
Yeah.
something I'm obviously very passionate about. I call my business eudaimonic by design because I think that we have so much more control over the design of those conditions for eudaimonia, eudaimonic well-being, purpose, meaning. We have so much more control over those environmental conditions, social conditions, the ways in which, the similar kinds of ways in which we garden, and ultimately, we can't control the seed, but we can control all of the conditions that go around the seed that will potentially lead to a flourishing plant. We can control so many more of those things for humans than we actually think of, and yet we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that.
Yeah. If you take the metaphor of designing a garden as committing to your passions, you can't control the weather, but you control whether there are weather resistant technologies that are available that you're using, such that in the midst of a snowstorm and in the midst of a heat wave, your garden can still actually be functioning in some capacity. And I do think that we ignore these environmental factors.
Mm. Are there any specific environmental factors that you'd drill down in terms of what the research is saying are really important?
So, pivoting from the environmental factors, I think that we forget that the human body is so fundamental in psychology. And I forgot the name of the researcher, but there's this nice 20-year longitudinal study in people age 55 and older, and showing that you can see over time that healthy habits, sleep hygiene, nutrition, exercise, they are predicting an increase in people's commitment and progress towards their purpose. And you're seeing less evidence for the other way around, that if you have a purpose, it improves your sleep hygiene. Because anyone who has found the book that they have to write, if anyone has basically decided, I want to raise kids and create them to be compassionate, great contributors to the world, this does not help your sleep hygiene, but it's really meaningful and profound. And I think one of the things that's really important to me that we need to pay more attention to in meaning in life and every element of the quote unquote good life is there's always a trade off. And so if you decide to have kids, and I don't bemoan anyone that decides not to, there's a huge psychological trade off in terms of your time and energy. And most people use cognitive dissonance to say it was worth it. And for some people, that it wasn't, and they didn't devote sufficient time and energy, which is something I've been wanting to study for 20 years now. But I do think that when we think about eudaimonia by design, is thinking about if I design my life, a big question is, do I do not want to have kids? Do I do not want to have like one significant romantic relationship? Do I want to be around my friends and build them into my time, such as the same way society norms push us to make the primacy your kids, your romantic partner, your family? You have to defy social norms to say, I'm putting my friends in the same priority space as those three silos.
Mhm. I feel like that's going to be a theme that we're going to hit upon again and again in this conversation, is the way in which we have to defy norms. We have to challenge the status quo. We have to buck against potential things that are going to come in our way that tell us, no, you have to be doing it this and this way. When in fact, if we actually do want to do it, what's best interest for us, what's in the best interest of society, we actually have to work pretty hard often against those currents.
Yeah, you could choose dozens of cultural war issues and dozens of things that are happening in society right now. Like just last night, I started reading Louise Perry's book called A Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she makes a very cogent argument based on evolutionary psychology that the sexual revolution, while it feels as if we're no longer repressive in the same way as time of Sigmund Freud and the time of the Victorian era, we're sort of comfortable with people's sexuality and sexual orientation, which is only a couple decades where you're comfortable with people that are non-heterosexual. And yet she's saying the benefits that for men as opposed to women is so extreme that it's amazing how feminists and society are not realizing that maybe there's a case that we pushed against one norm and didn't realize the costs of actually going against some of those conservative repressive instincts. We might have pushed them down too far or tried to dismantle them too quickly. And it actually caused problems with hookup culture and just kind of loveless romantic relationships and such.
Mm. One of the questions that I'm going to have for you, I think repeatedly as we continue to have this conversation, is the challenge of complexity in all of this. And I think that human beings are so fundamentally complex. And I think that what we learn, the more that we dive into psychology, the more that we think about the implications of psychology in the context of society and sociology and the context of all of the rippling layers of the ecosystems in which we exist, is how pushing any one piece of that system has unintended consequences that we never think about. And recognizing that every single person is different, that one size fits none, which is, I think, a very recurrent theme that we hear in this podcast from various researchers, makes it really hard to figure out, what do I do? Especially if I'm in charge of leading a team of other people and have to try to figure out the complexity. So how do you navigate that complexity in ways that don't prevent you from being able to move forward? I'm not necessarily looking for an answer. You're more than welcome to to try to
Well,
voice
I mean,
something.
there's one really nice, general, simple one that covers almost all territory, which is you have to have a reciprocal feedback loop
Mm,
at all times. And you have to have a culture where you can have productive conflict, which means that if Andrew, you're the person that you're my manager and I'm working at a supermarket, do I really have the ability to challenge some of the things you're saying I have to do and the way that I have to do it? If you're timing my performance and telling me how many things I have to do, and I have like physical ailments that are interfering with that, will I be penalized, as you're saying, as the unintended consequence of this, even though you're saying that I could actually speak my mind? So having some sort of way where there can be a provision of feedback in both ways and that there is a protective guardrail, kind of like when you bowl, when you have that little kids have that like that lane that appears on the side so you can't get a gutter ball, where I could say pretty much anything as long as it's not derogatory and harassing. And it'll be absorbed and I'll be protected where there's no retaliation.
mm. That's probably a good segue into the book that you've recently written, which is The Art of Insubordination: How to Dissent and Defy Effectively. And I think that piece, the subtitle is probably everything here. But I love this book for so many reasons. And it's not least because in my experience, I think one of the key ways in which people find meaning and purpose in their work is through defying, through taking a stand, through, various forms of activism and standing up for the things that they believe in. And so I think that this book is really important in so many ways. I think it's a really bold step for somebody associated with the positive psychology community to write a book in some ways about positive protest, in a way that I think that we've needed for a really long time. And I love the way in which there's so many things about this book. I will hold on to some of those things as we have this conversation. But tell me, why did you choose to write this book?
Well, thank you for all the kind words. I mean, the goal was to give away the knowledge of how you can protest better if you have healthy motivations to improve yourself, other people, the world. And as we're having this conversation, we're in the midst of university protests gone bananas all over the United States involving the Gaza Strip. The reason I wrote this was this. So you have to remember, this is before COVID. It's before Trump is president of the United States or even in consideration. And there's a couple of very interesting sociological trends at that time. So one was at that time, you had the Arab Spring. So you have social media being used by people in repressive regimes where they're able to get their voice out very quickly to much of humanity. And they don't need the proper channels. So that was interesting about like how do you amplify voice? Then you have these trends such as it's the lowest religiosity in the history of humanity. Now, what are the consequences of that? You have, Bowling Alone came out as a book 20 years earlier, and now you have the lowest religiosity ever. And the question is, well, what's going to be the replacement in terms of creating a sense of community? And since those trends started, You've only seen like, a rise in this so-called epidemic of loneliness, these high elevated levels. And people are talking about the lowest rates ever of having a close friend or confidant in their lives. And so all these trends you put together and you realize it's not just about being a whistleblower in an organization because they're engaging in fraud or financial malpractices. This is not just about fighting against sexual assault and rapes that are just at wild high levels in countries such as India, much less around the world. This isn't about child abuse, just reducing that in the Boy Scouts and in religious institutions. This is about very simple ways of how we live as an individual that maybe your approach to life deviates from other people. And a perfect norm that I think is really underappreciated is some people just want to be single. And it's not because they want to have a variety of partners. It's just that they don't like to share their space. They might be Elaine Aron's highly sensitive people. Thus, they don't want to have kids. They don't want to have a significant romantic partner. They're just going to have like a lot of friends and have a lot of autonomy that happens there. Our society over the course of history has viewed those people as not just outliers, but problematic people that are not doing their duty to pass on their lineage and contribute to society, as if your bodily autonomy should be the discussion and consideration of society.
Hmm. There's a way in which you define rebellion or principled rebels in this book, and you give a bit of an equation in the introduction. You talk about principled insubordination as having this equation of defiance times authenticity plus contribution over social pressure. And I'm just break that down for us. And if you can, especially try to break it down for us in a work related context.
Yeah, sure. So the first part is when you think about the numerator, the things you're trying to increase. You're talking about deviance is really nonconformity. To what degree do you think that there's a better way than the current practices in your organization? And so if you're thinking about sports, you could think about when was the first time that cold plunges came in as a way to repair your muscles in the aftermath of training or in the aftermath of the game. When that happened, it was considered bizarre, weird. Nobody was doing it. It was also expensive. It's still relatively expensive. Cryogenic chambers, same sort of thing. And then you're sort of asking for, let me experiment on myself and a few other people, and we'll check out what the evidence shows, because there has to be a way to improve the speed to which we recover. So that's the deviance or nonconformity part. The second part of that, like you mentioned, is the authenticity. Am I doing this because I care deeply about the mission and the cause? Or am I doing this for likability? Am I doing this because I want to win, like seek out a mate and find a mate kind of quickly? Am I doing this for social approval points that happen there? And a lot of people that engage in protests and try to think on your side, not just the other side, do things because they're seeking likability. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's worthwhile as individuals to carefully curate whether or not this is something that we're actually fighting for, or there's an underlying motive that has really nothing to do with the mission. And thus, there's a disingenuous element of this. In some ways, this is like protecting against disingenuous rebellions, curmudgeons, like people that just disagree with everyone in the meeting because they want to show that they're intelligent and that they're competent and that they're powerful people and they deserve to make more money and being promoted. Those people, it's in the equation to protect against that. And then the third part in the numerator is contribution, also related to motivation. Are you doing this because you're trying to improve something, trying to fix a problem? Or is this just something to entertain yourself as a source of meaning? I think a lot of protesters, whether it's climate change, whether it's politics, whether it's geopolitical conflicts, a lot of people do this because they don't have much meaning in their lives and they're something to glop onto. They get import. The thing that they're involved in is in the newspaper and in the media. And it's worth having the self-awareness of, am I really trying to contribute and move the needle on the reducing violence and conflict across the ocean to another country? Or am I just missing meaning in my life and getting something quickly that seems very accessible with very little cost to me? And then the final part of this equation for being a principled rebel, the more social pressure there is to act like everybody else, the less inclined you are to actually be involved and commit and put skin in the game towards your mission. And so we have to think about this. If you are the person that thinks there's a problem in an organization, there's too many work meetings, and you've calculated how much money and time is wasted on things that could be done by quick emails. If the pressure comes from everybody, the majority saying these meetings are what us allows us to have such a compassionate, friendly, loving culture. And that message comes through over and over again. Every time you comment, no one deals with your complaints or your thoughts or your suggestions. They're just saying, I don't think you're getting the culture. That's social pressure. And that social pressure, what it does is it shuts people down from offering new insights and ideas that aren't necessarily part of the zeitgeist at the time. And it's the last thing that we want to do. So we need that in the equation to say, when that's ramped up, you don't get unique ideas from diverse people with unique perspectives. And when we can reduce that social pressure, all of a sudden we're starting to create that environment where diverse people aren't just part of the team, but you're extracting their unique ideas so it can influence the team.
Right. As you were talking, I kind of break it down into four major questions. So in the numerator, what's the needle that I want to move? What am I going to specifically do to contribute? Plus, am I doing this for the right reasons? And then on the denominator, it's really, how might I buck the trends of all the things that are all of the social forces that are going to get in my way?
Yeah, I love it. I love when we turn this into provocative questions. Or to what degree am I making conformity pressure so high that people that disagree with me will not say a peep?
Hmm.
That's the denominator.
So you can be sure that there's going to be people listening to this podcast who are thinking, why on earth do I want more rebels in my mix? Like, in
Oh
fact,
yeah.
I've got enough, especially given protests of all different kinds within my ranks. Why do I want to even create more of this? What are they missing? What's so valuable about having principled rebels in your mix?
Yeah, the simplest way that I like to state this is dissent opens people's mind, conformity closes people's minds. And another way of phrasing this, just in a simple bumper sticker format, is dissent stimulates cognitive liberation. And so one of the important things that we've discovered, it's really Charlene Nemeth's work in California. I think she's retired now, is that even when the dissenter is wrong, their idea sucks. Like, it's just like, financially, your organization, you can't change the way that the office structure is designed. You can't go from an open space now back to a closed space. We don't have the money. We don't have the money. We don't have the time. It will close things down. We'll be losing sales. We'll be losing deals. In this situation, even though that can't be done, just by her raising that idea in the group, it makes people, okay, knowing that we have this financial constraint, what are the things people feel they're not able to do because there are too many mugs, too many faces that are near them that want to socialize and are socializing with them? And all of a sudden, you start to come up with a couple of original ideas that appear. Having the sunshade in your car so that UV light is refracted so your car doesn't get too warm. You could design something at a very cheap level in whatever little spot that you're working in. Can you design it so that if you have a nook where people can read and write, can there just be like a blanket that can be pulled over them? And on that blanket, it says, needs quiet time to focus. So there's very simple, cheap ways, but it all starts from a dissenter who has an idea that is absurd because of the finances of that organization. And I really want people to hold on to that, because the first thing we do, it's just instinctually, is when something gets it wrong, we like to point it out. We like to show that we're smart. And I think we just have to acknowledge, I'm not immune to this. You're not immune to this. No one in an organization is immune to this. And we have to not only prevent ourselves, but we have to call out a disincentive when someone else does it, when someone shares an idea that's relatively absurd.
Mhm. So we know it's good for the organization. We know that it will ultimately, it sounds like, build a culture of more innovation, creativity, a richer diversity of perspectives. It's good for the individual.
Yeah. Well, it's a mixed bag. But I just want to hit the last thing you said is so important, because I think we get diversity wrong in organizations. And I don't want to take us for a half hour on this topic, but I do think permitting and embracing dissent unlocks the benefits of diversity. That's my other slogan here,
Mm-hmm.
is we are like C plus in acquiring people that are diverse for our groups, our teams, our organizations. We are definitely at an F level in terms of getting the unique perspectives and ideas that are not shared with everyone else there. Now, you can get people to talk, you can get people to write emails, you can get people to comment on things, but are they saying the thing that mirrors what the majority is doing? If so, you're not unlocking the benefits of why you brought this person in the group in the first place.
Hmm.
You want their unique perspective, but what unique means is that you're not going to agree with everything they're going to say. And everyone nods their head to this, but you can see it and you can feel it. And there's the reasons that this consultants make so much money is because in general, people get shut down way too quickly for ideas prematurely because it's a little bit weird. It's a little bit mentally challenging and it's a little bit potentially fiscally challenging to consider that if we took their idea and stopped meetings as a manager, this is an inefficiency for me to get my job done because I normally have everyone in the room. I see everybody. I can refer to everyone in one fell swoop. So for that person's job, you just made it inefficient. Now they have to make individual meetings, individual emails that happen there. And so in some ways, if we get to it about what are the strategies for making sure that your unorthodox ideas are heard, one way is you have to acknowledge that this is going to be costly. It is going to be in the next 3 months to 6 months. I don't know the exact date. It'll be more difficult because you have to reconfigure the work that you're doing and how you do it. And what I'm saying is that if we're planning to do this for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years, it is better to start hit this now as opposed to we have a bunch of people in this room that we don't hear from, that we're not getting their ideas from, that their strengths aren't being leveraged because of the way that our group communications are designed.
Hmm. That short-term pain for long-term gain equation here seems so relevant, salient, important, and hard to be able to swallow,
Yeah.
especially if the next 3 months are going to be hell because we're trying to listen to everyone's perspective and do things differently. And how do we just get the work done? This gets back to that complexity, simplicity question I asked earlier.
Yeah, think about university admissions. So right now, the call first it was okay. Maybe we have to really think about demographic diversity and socioeconomic diversity. How are they being lost in the mix because they didn't have the resources to get the high SAT scores and to be in schools where they even knew these colleges even exist, much less a school counselor is available to actually help them work through how do you write a persuasive essay. They lack those opportunities to understand what was done by people that are raised by two people that went to a prestigious college. Now we're talking about legacy admissions, which means like if you have parents or grandparents that went to a school, you get a little bit of an edge. One of the things that is not discussed in this conversation is here's the trade off. For those people that have a legacy and your family has been donating money to this university, we know there's a pain point here. Here's our rationale for you because we know that for the next 2 generations, you just lost a free door that you've had for generations now. Nobody's saying that. Nobody is saying that in this conversation. As a result, you are losing sufficient traction and you're having unnecessary detractors for a very good idea that detracts from the people with the best potential get to go to the best schools.
I want to go back to something that you said that we would get to a moment ago, which is this good or bad for individuals? This is, we're on a podcast talking about meaningful work here. And, I think that activism is a really key part of what meaningful work is all about. And I don't think that it's probably always good for people, and it probably is in many ways. So what do we know about the individual consequences of being a principled rebellion?
Yeah, the research is really clear about this so-called black sheep effect. And that is you're part of the in-group. So let's say that you're working for Meta or Google or YouTube. You're in the in-group, you're tech, you're working in Silicon Valley. And then you're pointing out is that there are problems with the way that your services are run because there's a unnecessarily unfortunate high rate of child predators have access to children. Very clear, concrete issue, low base rate, but extremely problematic. When you do this and you raise this issue, you often get criticized in terms of offline, where people are saying, listen, you want me to redo all of the code and work that I'm already working on right now because of 1% of kids are being used as a relative or so forth. Do you realize how much money is going to have to be spent? How much work we're going to be undo that we've spent so much money on? That's the black sheep effect, is that because you understand the organization, the culture, the climate, the resources, the demands that are there, the fact that you're being an adversary is so problematic. We despise more the person that's one of us that criticizes us more than someone on the outside. So if it ended up being someone from government that was criticizing technology, you would be upset at them, but you'd be more willing to engage in reconciliation with them than someone that's to the inside. And we really despise people in our political group, whether we're red or blue, when it's someone on the inside of like, wait, you're going to cost us an election because you're criticizing the way that we're confronting things. And it is a emotionally challenging scenario that one of the reasons people don't protest or challenge their in-group, their friendship circle, their social circle, the organization that they identify as being part of a member, is this question that's often asked outside of conscious awareness, which is something you said before. Am I willing to absorb negative evaluation and rejection, knowing that this will not be taken well initially, and previous people who disagree with the group were not treated well? Most people say, hell no. I have enough stressors in my life. Inflation is going up. I've got kids' soccer games and volleyball games I've got to drive to and fro. I barely have time to go out for like 1 hour with my friends every couple of weeks. I don't have time for people to hate me right now. Like, I don't have the emotional fortitude to deal with this. And it's a real thing. It's true. And this comes back to the meaningful work. To what degree do you want to actually think about your lifespan as a worker, that you've done things that are important, meaningful, that you care for, despite the crucible moments where you actually had to take a few hits? And I think for myself, as a meaning researcher, purpose researcher, I think it's worth taking the hits, but not everyone has the temperament to do it. And so we can go through a whole bunch of strategies for people that maybe don't have the emotional tolerance for this kind of baggage.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. One of the things that I really love about your book is it is a cookbook. I'm a big cook. I love cooking. So I got really excited when at the close of each chapter there were recipe steps. They're very clear. Here's, if you want to do this, here's some things you really need to consider. So tell us a little bit about some of the pieces of creating that nonconformist cookbook that you think are really important for listeners to hear.
By the way, that was the original title, and the publisher nixed it. It was
It's a
supposed to
terrible
be called.
idea.
I
Terrible
know.
idea.
You
Probably.
had the anarchist cookbook, so I wanted to call it the nonconformist cookbook, and
Great.
designed the whole thing to be like it was an actual cookbook with recipes.
You need to, like, in the second version of this book, the second edition, just,
Yeah.
that's what you need to do.
So thank you for that, because it's a nice validation. One of the most important steps, and I just told this to we just had the final class in my semester of the science of well-being, the 22nd year of having the science of well-being college class. And somebody asked me, if you had one piece of advice for us over the whole semester, what would it be? And it's the exact same thing that's relevant to having the mental fortitude to challenge undesirable, unhealthy norms and people. It's that we have to expand the number of dimensions that comprise our sense of self. And we have to invest in those other parts of ourself such that when one of the parts of ourself takes a hit, it's so clear it's just a tiny little flesh wound, as opposed to our entire sense of identity is at risk when we're rejected in the workplace. And so that's the abstract. Now, concretely, you could think about this as a number of circles inside of a larger circle that we'll call the self. And so if your work provides a profound sense of meaning or purpose, it's going to be in the bullseye. It's going to be thick, bold, italicized, flashing neon lights. And if your family's important, that's going to be a huge bolded circle. If you have a close best friend, that's going to be a huge circle. Maybe you're like me, you go to the gym every day. That's part of my identity as a bodybuilder. That's a big circle. If your thing's gardening, it's in there. If your thing's pickleball, it's in there. If surfing's your thing, if it ends up being having really close ties to your neighbors, maybe your political affiliation, maybe your gender. Like maybe it's really important in terms of being a woman or a man, and that really defines you. It's not just part of you. Then those are bigger circles. when you are going to challenge the status quo, when you're going to challenge conventional thinking, you really at that moment, it's weird. You want to now diversify your portfolio and spend a lot of time outside of work before you make the big reveal of what you're going to be challenging, criticizing, or suggesting deserves change. This is not when you pull back from playing pickleball. This is not when you spend less time with your kids. It's that with a diversified portfolio in that scenario, any hit you get, it will still sting, but it will just be small cuts as opposed to you're under the guillotine and your entire self worth is on the chopping block.
What an interesting finding. It's interesting, not least of which because of the ways that some of the research that I've seen around the dark sides of meaningful work suggests that when the moral stake is high, when frankly we have obsessive passion around the thing that we really, really care about, the thing that is the immediate consequence to that is boundary inhibition. Like literally all of the things that might protect us, that would allow us to go play pickleball, that would allow us to go and be able to connect with our spouses. Those are the very things that disintegrate and work becomes everything. And that mixed portfolio actually a major consequence of being deeply invested in your work, especially when you think it's really important, is that those things actually go away. And it becomes even harder to think about mixed portfolio because work fills the entire space.
Yeah, yeah. And it's worthwhile to see. So choose your favorite iconic figure. Let's just play with Elon Musk because he's so in the public right now, whether you love or hate him, is there's a storyline of here is this so-called quote unquote genius who has developed multiple companies, invested in multiple big companies, made a huge whirlwind of cash. And when you think about Tesla and you think about Neuralink and you think about, whatever his
SpaceX.
rocket ships to Mars,
Yeah.
SpaceX, in this case, you think of he is spending 80, 100 hours a week in the workplace. And the thing is, in the reality, if you read, biographical and autobiographical information about this guy is he's really good at actually outsourcing a lot of these activities, a lot of these managerial roles, and a lot of these technical specifications, and a lot about, copyrights and trademarks and et cetera to other people. I mean, that's one of the, and it's worthwhile to go behind the media storyline to realize that this guy actually has a pretty well diversified portfolio. He has a number of kids. He has a wife. How that's going, we don't have good clarity. I don't really care. I don't think anyone listening cares, but it's diversified. As such, he takes hits, and it seems like he's okay at absorbing hits for a lot. I mean, he's taking a lot of hits. And I think when we get whittled down, very filtered stories about Nelson Mandela, Steve Jobs, Martha Graham, Martha Stewart, Rosa Parks, we get Martin Luther King, we get filtered stories as if Martin Luther King's entire life was only revolved around civil rights. And you don't get sufficient information about how much time he spent on religiosity and going to church and spending time with friends. He did have a number of infidelities. So that was a big part of his life, would end up being the romantic elements of his life. And I don't think this takes away from his legacy. I think it makes it realize it is attainable as him as an imperfect person for other imperfect people to do what he did. He happened to have oratorical skills and leadership skills that were at the 99th percentile. But the other parts of his diversified life makes you realize, he's kind of like us. He messes up a lot, makes a lot of mistakes, cares about things bigger than himself. He's not only focused on this one singular issue. As a result, he was able to take a lot of hits. And then you have someone as not necessarily an iconic figure in the same way of producing that social good, but Marilyn Monroe. So Marilyn Monroe at the time was an iconic trailblazer in terms of however you want to describe it. A woman becoming a powerful figure in society. Let's just be as generous as humanly possible. She did not have a diversified portfolio. Her defining feature throughout her power and dominance was all focused on her physicality. And as a result, there's more to the story to it, is she had a pretty tragic death. She committed suicide. She realized that she was being overly identified for the singular dimension of her life. And I would say less Martha Stewart, less Marilyn Monroe, more Martin Luther King, more Elon Musk in terms of If you diversify, then the singular features that people try to define you as, the singular comment that people didn't like, that they determine that's going to be your legacy. It doesn't stick to you. It's just comments, negative comments and feedback that you're getting.
Hmm. Love this notion of the mixed portfolio. It's so useful in so many different ways and so instructive for people who I think have life, have work fill so much meaning in their lives to realize, no, it's actually really important for you to find other slices of your will of life that you need to invest meaning in as well. But all the people that you're talking about right now are people who are powerful in very real ways in our world and society. And one of the things that I really love in the book is the way that you talk about what Doc Keltner might call the power paradox, the ways in which what gets us into positions of power and authority often seem to get corrupted once we're there. And many of the people that you just mentioned are great examples of people who, you know, we really admired them in their rise to power, but then when they got there, you're like, "Ooh, God, what happened to you now?" So,
Right.
will you
Right.
tell us a little bit about that and what it means for principled rebellion?
Yeah, there's this great body of research that I've never seen discussed anywhere except for the scientific journals, which is that when you move from the minority, the person with unorthodox ideas, original ideas, and then all of a sudden it gets traction and you get more than 50% approval, and now you become the majority, the dominant view, what happens to you? And the science is really clear, is that once you move from minority to majority status, you end up holding and identifying very strongly with now the dominant view, which is now the thing that you helped originate. And as a result, you show the same in-group favoritism and out-group denigration and dislike that the people did who are in power that you challenged in the first place. And you could see this across demographic groups. You could see, irrespective of age, race, sex, hasn't really been explored in the sexual orientation. I'm assuming if you're gay or straight, it ends up being pretty similar in terms of the psychology here, is you have now very non-permeable boundaries in terms of who gets access to resources and who doesn't. And there's some great studies where you actually find is that when you were given opportunities to bring the once powerful, now minority into your fold so they can be of service and help with this new path that you've helped create, is they're often rejected. And as a result, they move from possible allies to now adversaries. And now your life is more difficult, all because you tripped over your own ego.
Hmm. And it very much is reflective of various things that I have certainly heard within the 2S LGBTQ plus worlds, specifically around gay men, for whom I feel like I'm put myself in that category, you know, has become part of the dominant majority in the queer space. And many others in that 2S LGBTQ plus acronym are like, wow, you're exactly the problem now as a gay man relative to, you know, trans rights or relative to asexuality or relative to spirited, you know, qualities. Like there's different ways of being able to say that corruption of power in that way too.
Yeah. And so, as someone who grew up in New York City, when you think about what the gay pride parade looked like, or a gay pride day week in New York City in the 1980s versus now, it's so sanitized to be accepted by people like me and the majority of the culture, which it is. But there's something that's lost. There's a lost element of, there was a piece in terms of we get to be exactly who we are as if nobody was looking, and
Mm.
nobody really was looking except to kind of criticize us and attack us physically and verbally. But in the modern world, can we create spaces for people to have that minority status still honored and respected space in there, despite now being part of and absorbed into the majority? And I think sometimes when you see gay culture being prioritized and marketed and sold and become this capitalistic empire, is what's lost is that we're not like other people. We're not trying to be like other people, but we want to be accepted in all the spaces of things that we want to do. And I think we haven't quite figured that out yet. We no longer have the military, don't act, don't tell. We no longer have a separate parade that's in Provincetown in Massachusetts and, in Greenwich Village, New York. It's now everywhere. But I don't think that we've got the balance right in terms of our culture is being honored for us, with us, no one else there. And then why should my sexual orientation be a variable in something such as astrophysics or bench pressing or being in a CrossFit competition? Because the two things have nothing to do with each other.
I can't believe that we've already been talking for as long as we could. I feel like this conversation could probably go on for hours, but I'm going to move into my last major question for us, which is it revolves around the last section of your book, which is really about how you design the conditions to harness disobedience, going back to the earlier parts of our conversation about designing. And so I'm curious about what recipe you'd give us to create a rebel friendly culture. And I want to go back to something else that you mentioned earlier, that we're having this conversation in a week where there are universities all across North America that are having massive protests and encampments around Israel and Gaza. And those universities are fundamentally being asked a whole bunch of really interesting questions around what kind of spaces they are designing, right? When
Yeah.
it comes to the capacity to have rebel friendly cultures. And so I'm curious how would you tie those things together in terms of the recipes you might offer in the book and this very practical reality that we see in universities all across North America?
Yeah, I hope this is heard by so many people. So let me give the automatic caveat of I don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of ideas for improving the way things are currently done. And that's really what we're talking about here. Anyone who says they have all the answers, like you said, these issues are extremely complex. It's very easy to point out what's wrong. And it's a little bit better to actually say, experiment with this. So that I'm saying, here are some experiments that I suggest based on the science. One is really clear, which is I haven't seen any university except for Brown University pull this off so far, which is you have to clarify verbally, regularly, separate task conflict from relationship conflict. That's not being done right now, which
What
is
do you mean
that.
by that?
So in this example of university protests involving Gaza, just as our concrete example, is to separate you're our students, everyone here who is a student, you're part of our student body. You paid money into the system. Our job is to mentor you and care for you, provide you security, scaffolding, develop skills, knowledge. You're supposed to make mistakes. You're supposed to give second chances. You're supposed to try things out. You're supposed to develop your identity in your early 20s. That's the relationship part. That is intact. Now let's talk about, let's not infect that. And when it does, let us know because we have to actually quarantine that away from the task conflict. Now we have a task conflict, which is that we're talking about a couple of conversations here. One, what can you do here right now that's going to help people in Israel, Palestine? Most people have one of the two is the one that they're advocating for. So there's a big question there in terms of mentoring and advising and helping is what you're doing. And you can ask, it's kind of like the question you helped me kind of take my equation and turn into question form. To what degree is you obstructing people going to their classes, which is what we're trying to do is teach and educate people, serving the purpose of people in Israel or Palestine? Now, I haven't heard anyone ask that question. I've heard anyone answer that question. It would be a good one. And you can go through all the different tasks. There's a lot of good science and social psychology in terms of what types of rebellious behaviors win supporters and adherents and help move the cause, and which one end up having detractors unnecessarily, such that now you have people that want to crush you. And not because of what you believe in, but because of the way that you're engaging in the rebellious behavior. And so if you just start asking some basic questions from a place of curiosity of, I want to help you improve the cause you care about. So when people at Brown University, they sat down with students, they elected sort of leaders of the protest and said, let's sit down and go through what does the university use their endowment to invest in? How much of it is involved in foreign countries? What percentage is involving Muslim-based countries? What's involving Israel? And let's have a conversation. And that seems to be one of the big goals. So then you get the question of spray painting. How's that related to that? Locking people from go to class. How is that related to that? Stopping a commencement, stopping the graduation ceremonies, making it such that students can't go to the library and study things such as like law to help the disadvantaged in society as This is not like working for Suits to work for this money-making firm, because you're blocking them that happens there. And that task-focused conflict, focusing there, that's where the action is for diversity, diverse ideas, and we can get very creative and innovative. But because the two have been blended together, it's basically as the students are being attacked themselves by administrators, by the public, by other students, and it's getting mixed in with the tasks. And so it's not being able to be disentangled, because there are really good things to play with here. There are really good questions about what should a university be investing in. And this conversation can't take place if you mix the two.
Hmm. Thank you for being able to come up with an answer quickly within that context and be able to weave together a whole bunch of nuances. And I feel like this task identity and relational identity piece are actually really important things within any organizational context in terms of
Agreed.
being able to understand, hey, how do we think about conflict in ways that can be really, really productive as opposed to threatening in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, because nobody in your organization should be considered the outgroup, denigrated, ostracized. That has very powerful implications for reducing people's intellectual potential and their creative contributions. And everything that's happened that's going with the protests involving Gaza, every organization should be looking at it and asking themselves, if the conflict was about something in our organization, what would we be doing to not minimize the conversation and not minimizing the perspectives that are there, but creating a space where it actually can occur, where it's actually productive? I think a lot of organizations could have really great conversations. They think they're talking about the Middle East, and they're actually talking about how can we actually have conflict in a way such that we can move the needle and become more innovative and productive and have a healthy culture.
Todd, do you have anything else any last words or any last questions that you think that we should have talked about when it comes to meaningful work?
We hit a lot. I mean, it's a whole nother podcast in itself. I think a really important one is about social relationships and basically how do we cultivate allies, supporters, cheerleaders, our mental health providers in our social circle for ourselves, and then how do we design cultures in a way that people can actually form friendships that are beyond the interests and personalities, which is most organizations, friendships form due to similarities in interests, values, politics, personalities. And I think that's a wasted opportunity for designing a culture where you can cut across personality matrices.
Wonderful. Well, we obviously need a part B to this podcast. Thank you so much, Todd. I'm so grateful for all the wisdom that you've shared today. I really encourage people to go out and grab this book, The Art of Insubordination. It is fantastic. And it's just really wonderful to spend this time together.
Oh my God, you asked the best questions. Like I had so much fun with you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.